Amala stood at the edge of her garden, her fingers trailing along the delicate petals of the hibiscus flowers that flourished under the intense African sun. These flowers were a labor of love, a silent escape from the restlessness that had settled into her life. The vibrant colors of the petals seemed to taunt her, their vitality contrasting starkly with the quiet dullness that filled her days. It was on a particularly warm afternoon, with the scent of earth heavy in the air, that she noticed him, Kofi, her neighbor living just on the other side of the fence, separated from her by a simple line of bamboo reeds. She'd seen him many times before, of course, but never quite like this. The late afternoon light cast a golden glow over his frame as he tended to his small vegetable patch, his strong hands moving skillfully through the rows of plants. Every movement he made was unhurried, almost reverent, as if each task deserved his full presence. Amal found herself captivated. There was a quiet, earthy energy in him, something that called to her in a way that was both familiar and foreign. His worn shirt clung to his back, dampened by the day's work, and every muscle seemed to speak of years spent mastering his craft, learning the rhythm of the land. She marveled at how focused he was, unaware of her gaze, lost in his own world. It had been a long time since she had seen such undistracted dedication in anyone. Her husband, by contrast, was a man of numbers, a man whose life revolved around papers and figures that meant little to her. He spent his time in closed, air-conditioned rooms, his hands unmarked by labor, his skin softened by years away from the fields. He was often absent, physically and emotionally drifting through their home like a ghost bound to routines and expectations. She had accepted this distance long ago, burying her longing in her garden, in the small, unspoken beauty of things that required no explanation. But today, as she watched Kofi, something within her stirred, like a long-buried seed finally pushing through the earth to feel the sun. The garden fence was just tall enough to provide privacy, but low enough to allow glimpses between them. She began to notice small details, the way he would occasionally pause to wipe his brow with the back of his hand, his shoulders rising and falling in a steady rhythm as he worked. She found herself drawn to these simple gestures, these moments of quiet strength that seemed so effortless in him. It was absurd, she knew, to feel this way over something as mundane as a man working his garden. And yet she found herself returning to the fence each afternoon, her hands busily tending to her own plants as her eyes drifted towards him. She took great care to appear casual, to hide the quickening of her pulse whenever he came into view. It became a game, a ritual, something that added a spark of anticipation to her otherwise predictable routine. As the days passed, Amal became acutely aware of his presence, even when he wasn't there. The garden seemed different now, as if it held secrets between them, secrets born of glances and shared silences. She could feel the subtle energy between them growing, as real as the roots that spread unseen beneath the soil. There were no words exchanged, no acknowledgments of the glances that lingered just a little too long, and yet she felt as if she knew him in a way that defied logic. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of purple and orange, Amal lingered a little longer in her garden. She could see Kofi on the other side, his silhouette softened by the twilight. She watched him as he stood there, taking in the quietness of the evening, his hands resting on his hips as he looked out over his plants. There was a peace in him that she envied, a sense of belonging that she had never quite found. In the stillness, her mind wandered. She wondered what it would be like to be near him, to feel the warmth of his presence beside her. She imagined his hands, calloused yet gentle, touching her own, grounding her in a way she had not felt in years. It was a foolish thought, she told herself, a flight of fancy. But the longing that had taken root in her heart would not be so easily dismissed. Amal's life was filled with small, calculated steps, a delicate balance of duty and restraint. She had learned to find contentment in the little things, in the quiet spaces between her husband's comings and goings. But now, in these moments by the fence, she felt the fragile walls she had built around her heart beginning to crumble. As the last light faded, she finally turned to go back inside. She moved slowly, as if unwilling to break the spell that had settled over the garden. But before she could step away, she caught one final glance of Kofi. This time he was looking in her direction. Their eyes met, a brief moment stretched into eternity, neither of them moving, neither of them speaking. There was a warmth in his gaze, a quiet understanding that seemed to reach across the distance between them. Amal felt her heart quicken, the silence between them filling with possibilities she dared not name. There was something comforting and exhilarating in that look, a spark that threatened to set her entire being aflame. But just as quickly as it began, the moment passed. She looked away, her cheeks flushed, her heart pounding as if she had just run a great distance. In the solitude of her room that night, she lay awake, replaying the day's encounters in her mind. The world seemed different now, her once familiar garden transformed into a place filled with secrets and silent promises. And as she drifted into restless sleep, she found herself longing for tomorrow, for another glimpse across the fence that separated them. She knew it was a dangerous game, this unspoken dance between them. But for the first time in years she felt truly alive, as if she were rediscovering herself in the reflection of his gaze. The world outside her window seemed to hold its breath, waiting, like her, for what was yet to come. In the days that followed, Amal's life took on a new rhythm, one punctuated by fleeting encounters with Kofi that left her breathless and rattled. It was as if the earth itself had conspired to pull them together in quiet, inconspicuous places on the path to the village, in the fields, or under the wide, sprawling branches of the ancient baobab tree that had watched over her land for generations. One morning, as the sky blushed with the first light of dawn, Amal was drawn to the village well, her steps slow and contemplative. She hadn't expected to see anyone so early, and yet there he was, Kofi, his figure silhouetted against the soft light, his shoulders broad, his posture calm and steady. He was filling a large jug, his hands working methodically, with a patience that seemed to flow from the earth itself. Amal froze, suddenly aware of her heartbeat thundering in her chest. She hadn't anticipated the effect he would have on her, the way his simple presence stirred a longing that felt as natural and as ancient as the land beneath her feet. He noticed her then, looking up with a quiet intensity that seemed to reach across the distance between them. His gaze, dark and unflinching, met hers, and the air thickened, humming with an energy that neither dared to name. She stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly as she moved toward the well. There were no words exchanged, only the soft crunch of gravel underfoot as she approached him. Kofi held out his jug, his hand steady and assured, and as she reached out to take it, her fingers brushed against his. The warmth of his skin against hers sent a shiver down her spine, a shock of connection that lingered even after she withdrew her hand. The brief touch seemed to ignite something within her, a fire she hadn't felt in years. Amal had spent so long existing in a state of quiet resignation, buried under layers of duty and propriety. But now, in that single moment, those layers began to peel away, leaving her raw and vulnerable, her heart exposed. She lowered her gaze, not wanting him to see the storm that was rising within her, yet unable to pull herself away from him entirely. The days passed, and their paths continued to cross with an almost painful regularity. She would see him at the market, his back turned as he bartered with the vendors, his laughter mingling with the hum of the crowd. Or she would catch sight of him in the fields, his hands working the soil, his figure outlined against the bright expanse of sky. Each encounter left her with a sense of restless anticipation, a feeling that settled deep within her bones and refused to fade. One afternoon, as she walked home with a basket of vegetables, she found herself once again in his presence. He was standing near the path that led to her home, his gaze fixed on something distant, his posture relaxed but purposeful. She slowed her steps, her heart quickening as she approached. It felt as though the very air around them was alive, charged with an unspoken tension that neither could ignore. Without a word, Kofi turned to face her, his eyes softening as they met hers. He stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking to a mere breath. The silence was thick, almost tangible, filled with the weight of everything they wanted to say but couldn't. Amal felt her resolve weakening, felt herself surrendering to the quiet intensity of his presence. She could feel his warmth, could see the gentle rise and fall of his chest, each breath mirroring her own. Her pulse raced as he lifted his hand, his fingers brushing against the side of her face, so light and delicate that it felt like a whisper. The touch was fleeting, almost hesitant, as if he too was afraid of crossing an invisible line. But in that moment the world around them faded, leaving only the two of them suspended in time. Amal's breath hitched, her skin tingling where his fingers had grazed her. The sensation lingered, seeping into her like rain soaking into dry earth, filling a void she hadn't even realized existed. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for answers, for something to ground her in the midst of the storm that had taken root within her. Kofi's gaze softened, his eyes filled with a warmth that seemed to speak of understanding, of shared secrets and unspoken dreams. There was a gentleness in his expression, a silent reassurance that she hadn't felt in years. Amal's heart swelled, her defenses crumbling as she allowed herself to lean into that feeling, to let herself be vulnerable in his presence. But just as quickly as the moment had come, it was gone. Kofi pulled back, his hand falling to his side as he stepped away, his expression guarded once more. The spell was broken, leaving Amal standing alone, her heart aching with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. That night, as she lay awake, the memory of his touch haunted her, the ghost of his fingers still lingering on her skin. She knew that what she felt for him was forbidden, that it went against every vow she had made, every promise she had kept. But she also knew that she couldn't stop herself from wanting him, from yearning for the warmth and understanding that only he seemed to offer. In the days that followed, the encounters became more frequent, more intense. A glance across the marketplace, a brush of hands as they passed each other on the path, each interaction fueling the fire that burned between them. She could feel herself losing control, slipping further into a world of longing and desire that threatened to consume her entirely. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the land, Amal found herself standing at the edge of her garden, her gaze fixed on the small house across the way. She could see Kofi through the window, his figure silhouetted against the fading light, his posture relaxed and at ease. She watched him, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing with thoughts she could barely contain. And then, as if sensing her gaze, he looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the distance that separated them. In that moment she knew that the barrier between them was only an illusion, a fragile thing that could be shattered with a single step, a single act of courage. Amal felt her breath catch, her heart swelling with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She knew that what lay ahead was uncertain, that the path she was contemplating was fraught with danger and consequences she could barely fathom. But as she stood there, caught in the intensity of his gaze, she realized that she was ready to risk it all, to follow the pull that had brought them together, no matter where it might lead. For the first time in years she felt alive, her heart beating with a rhythm that was both foreign and achingly familiar. And as the last light faded from the sky, she took a step forward, her mind racing, her body trembling with anticipation. There was no turning back now. The choice had been made, the path set. All that remained was to see where it would lead. As the days slipped by, Amal felt her existence shift, as if an invisible thread bound her to Kofi, pulling her closer to him in ways she couldn't explain. The silence between them was not empty but laden with meaning, an unspoken language that only they seemed to understand. Every look, every lingering glance, every fleeting touch carried a weight that left her breathless. One afternoon, while out gathering herbs near the edge of her property, Amal sensed his presence even before she saw him. There was a subtle shift in the air, a feeling of warmth and tension, as if the very earth beneath her feet vibrated with his energy. She turned, and there he was, standing a few paces away, his gaze steady and unwavering. Their eyes met, and Amal felt a surge of something powerful and consuming, a force she hadn't felt in years. She felt stripped bare, vulnerable, as if he could see straight into her heart. into the places she had kept hidden even from herself. It was terrifying, exhilarating, like standing on the edge of a cliff and feeling the pull of gravity tugging her forward. She held his gaze, unable to look away, caught in the intensity of his dark, unreadable eyes. The silence between them thickened, and for a moment she felt as if the world around them had faded, leaving only the two of them in a space outside of time. She was acutely aware of his breathing, of the rise and fall of his chest, the subtle movement of his hand as he reached out, as if drawn to her by some invisible force. The tips of his fingers brushed against hers, light as a whisper, and her pulse quickened, her skin tingling at the point of contact. It was such a small gesture, barely even a touch, yet it held a depth of feeling that left her shaken. She felt as though he had reached into her chest and touched her heart, igniting a fire that spread through her veins, leaving her breathless and wanting. Kofi's gaze never wavered, his eyes searching hers as if looking for something, as if he, too, felt the magnetic pull between them. Amal felt a surge of longing, a need so deep and raw that it frightened her. She wanted to step closer, to close the distance between them, to feel his warmth, his strength. But something held her back, a fear that if she gave in to this feeling, it would consume her entirely. Days turned into nights, and Amal found herself haunted by his presence even when he wasn't there. She could feel him in the stillness of her room, in the shadows that crept across the walls, in the quiet moments when she was alone with her thoughts. It was as if he had left an imprint on her soul, a mark that she could not erase. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the land, Amal ventured to the edge of her garden. She was drawn to the bamboo fence that separated their properties, the place where they had shared so many silent moments, where their connection had taken root and grown, deep and unspoken. She stood there, her fingers grazing the rough texture of the bamboo, her heart racing with a mixture of anticipation and longing. She could feel the energy between them, a current that pulsed through the air, connecting them in ways that defied logic. She didn't know if he was there, if he was watching her, but she could feel him, feel his presence as real and tangible as the ground beneath her feet. As the light faded, casting everything in a warm, golden glow, she saw him. He stood on the other side of the fence, his face partially hidden in shadow, his posture relaxed but alert, as if he had been waiting for her. Their eyes met, and in that moment she felt a surge of emotion so powerful it left her breathless. She felt seen, truly seen, in a way that no one had ever seen her before. They stood there in silence, the distance between them both infinite and insignificant. The air was thick with tension, a tension that was both thrilling and terrifying. Amal felt as if she was standing on the edge of something vast and unknown, a precipice that beckoned her forward, promising both ecstasy and ruin. She reached out, her hand hovering just above the fence, as if testing the boundary between them. Kofi mirrored her movement, his hand meeting hers with a gentleness that belied the intensity of his gaze. Their fingers touched, and Amal felt a jolt of electricity shoot through her, a shock that left her trembling. In that moment she felt as if she was on fire, her skin tingling, her heart racing, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. She felt alive in a way she hadn't felt in years, as if every nerve ending in her body had come alive, attuned to the energy that pulsed between them. It was both exhilarating and terrifying, a feeling that left her dizzy and unsteady, as if the ground beneath her had shifted. Kofi's hand tightened slightly around hers, his touch firm and steady, grounding her, anchoring her in the midst of the storm that raged within her. She looked into his eyes, and in that moment she saw a reflection of her own desire, her own longing mirrored back at her. It was a silent acknowledgement, a shared understanding that transcended words, a bond that went beyond the physical. They stood there, their hands entwined, their gazes locked, lost in the intensity of the moment. Amal felt as if she was on the brink of something profound, something that had the power to change her life in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. She knew that this connection, this bond between them, was dangerous, that it threatened to unravel everything she had built, everything she had held dear. But in that moment she didn't care. She was willing to risk it all, to surrender to the pull of this connection, to let it take her wherever it would lead. She felt a surge of courage, a boldness that surprised her, a willingness to defy convention, to break free from the constraints that had bound her for so long. Slowly, reluctantly, they released their hands, the loss of contact leaving her feeling hollow, as if a part of her had been torn away. But the connection remained, a thread that bound them together, a promise of something more, something that went beyond the physical. As Amal turned to leave, she felt a strange sense of peace, a calmness that settled over her, soothing the turmoil that had plagued her for so long. She knew that this connection, this bond, was something rare and precious, something that she would carry with her always. In the days that followed, she found herself drawn back to that place, to the fence that separated them, to the space where their hands had touched, where their connection had deepened. It became a sanctuary, a place where she could be herself, where she could feel, truly feel, without fear or judgment. Amal knew that this connection was forbidden, that it went against everything she had been taught, everything she had believed in. But she also knew that it was real, that it was something she could not deny, something she could not walk away from. And as she stood there, her hand resting on the fence, her heart full of longing and hope, she felt a sense of clarity, a sense of purpose. She was ready to embrace this connection, to let it guide her, to see where it would lead. For the first time in her life, she felt free, free to be herself, free to love, free to feel. And as the sun set, casting its golden glow over the land, Amal knew that she had found something worth fighting for, something worth risking everything for. She was ready to follow this connection, to see where it would take her, to surrender to the pull of her heart. And in that moment she felt a sense of peace, a sense of joy, a sense of purpose. She was ready to let go, to embrace the unknown, to step into the light and follow her heart, wherever it might lead. The evening air was thick, wrapped in the scent of jasmine and warm earth as Amal waited, her heart pounding with a rhythm that seemed to echo in the stillness around her. The world was quiet, cloaked in the secrecy of the late hour. Shadows stretched across the land, wrapping her in their cool embrace, as if they too understood the significance of what was about to unfold. This was the night she had both feared and longed for, a night stolen from the routines of her life, hidden from prying eyes and the relentless expectations that bound her. Her husband had left for business in the village, his absence a window that would close as quickly as it had opened. Amal's pulse quickened at the thought, her skin alive with anticipation, her senses sharpened to every faint sound, every whisper of the wind. A soft knock at the door brought her back to herself, pulling her from the whirlpool of thoughts that had consumed her. She took a steadying breath, her hand hovering over the handle, a quiet tremor betraying the calm she tried to project. Slowly she opened the door, and there he was, Kofi, standing in the threshold, his expression both unreadable and filled with a depth that took her breath away. He stepped inside without a word, the door closing softly behind him, sealing them off from the world outside. The room felt smaller with him there, the space between them charged, heavy with all the emotions they had kept locked away. Amal's gaze lingered on him, taking in the quiet strength in his posture, the warmth that seemed to radiate from him in waves, filling the room with a sense of intimacy that bordered on sacred. They stood there, just a breath apart, their eyes locked in a silent exchange, a conversation that needed no words. The unspoken understanding between them was overwhelming, a force that transcended the boundaries they had both kept so carefully intact. Amal's heart pounded, a wild, unsteady beat that seemed to fill the silence, drowning out everything else. Kofi lifted his hand slowly, his fingers brushing lightly against her cheek, the touch as delicate as a whisper. Amal closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, feeling the warmth of his hand against her skin, the roughness of his calloused fingers a stark contrast to the gentleness of his caress. She felt as if she was melting, dissolving into that simple touch, her carefully constructed walls crumbling, leaving her exposed and vulnerable in a way she had never allowed herself to be. Without a word, Kofi's hand slid down, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, his touch a slow, deliberate exploration that sent a shiver down her spine. She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze once more, and in that moment she saw everything she had ever wanted reflected back at her. It was a look of tenderness, of longing, of a love so deep and fierce it left her breathless. Time seemed to lose its meaning as they stood there, suspended in a moment that felt both infinite and fleeting. Amal's hand found its way to his, their fingers intertwining, a silent vow passing between them. There was a sweetness in the simplicity of that touch, a purity that spoke of the bond they shared, a connection that went beyond the physical, beyond the boundaries of time and circumstance. And then, as if moved by some unseen force, Kofi leaned forward, his forehead resting gently against hers. Amal closed her eyes, savoring the warmth of his breath on her skin, the steady beat of his heart in perfect rhythm with her own. She felt a sense of peace wash over her, a calm that settled deep within her, grounding her, anchoring her in the midst of the storm that had raged within her for so long. They stayed like that, locked in a silent embrace, their bodies pressed close, their breaths mingling, each one a promise, a confession, a plea. It was a moment of surrender, a moment where the world outside faded, leaving only the two of them, bound together in a connection that defied explanation. Finally, as the night deepened and the world outside grew still, Kofi pulled back, his hand lingering on her cheek, his gaze lingering on her face, as if memorizing every detail, every line, every shadow. Amal felt a pang of sadness, a bittersweet ache that settled in her chest, a reminder of the fleeting nature of this moment, of the reality that would soon return. He took a step back, and she felt the loss of his warmth, the emptiness that filled the space between them. But even as he moved away, the connection remained, a thread that bound them, a promise that lingered in the silence. Amal watched as he left, her heart both heavy and light, a strange mix of sorrow and joy, of regret and fulfillment. She knew that this night would stay with her, etched into her memory, a secret she would carry with her always, a part of her soul that would forever be entwined with his. As the door closed behind him, Amal stood there, alone once more, the quiet of the night settling around her like a shroud. But she felt different, changed, as if she had discovered a part of herself she had long forgotten, a part of her that had been awakened by his touch, by the warmth of his embrace. And as she made her way to bed, her heart still racing, her skin still tingling with the memory of his touch, she knew that this was only the beginning. In the days following their secret meeting, Amal was haunted by an aching emptiness that clung to her like a shadow. Her mind drifted to Kofi constantly, and the memory of his touch lingered on her skin like a whisper she couldn't silence. Yet beneath the warmth of that memory, an icy wave of guilt surged, pulling her into its depths and leaving her breathless. Amal found herself moving through her daily life like a ghost, disconnected from everything around her. Her husband's absence had become both a blessing and a curse, offering her solitude yet forcing her to face the raw truth of what she had done. She had crossed an invisible line, allowed herself to be swept away, and now there was no returning to the life she had known before. In the quiet hours of the night, she lay awake, her heart torn between longing and regret. The dark ceiling above seemed vast and unyielding, mirroring the weight in her chest, pressing down on her until she felt she might suffocate under its weight. She pressed her hand to her chest, trying to quell the storm of emotions that churned within her, but nothing could erase the memory of Kofi, the feel of his presence, his warmth, his gaze. It was as if he had left a part of himself with her, an invisible mark that bound her to him, regardless of the vows she had once made. Amal's mind raced with questions, doubts that echoed in the silence, each one a dagger that pierced her heart. How could she have betrayed the man who had shared her life for so many years? How could she have let herself be drawn so deeply into this forbidden connection? And yet, even in the midst of her guilt, there was a part of her that yearned for him, that longed to feel his touch once more, to be held in his arms, safe and cherished. She tried to push those thoughts away, to bury them beneath layers of duty and loyalty, but they clawed their way back to the surface, refusing to be silenced. She began to avoid the garden, the place where their connection had first taken root. The sight of the bamboo fence, the familiar scent of the flowers she had once tended so carefully, all of it served as a reminder of what she had shared with Kofi, a reminder of the passion that had bloomed between them in the shadows of her world. She could feel the pull, a magnetic force drawing her back to him, yet her conscience held her firmly in place, binding her to a life she had once accepted without question. Days blurred into nights, and Amal grew restless, a captive of her own heart. She was caught between two worlds, one where duty bound her to the life she had known, and another where her spirit soared, unfettered, in the warmth of Kofi's embrace. Each passing day made the chasm between these worlds feel wider, the choice she faced more impossible. She found herself retreating, pulling back from the people around her, the friends and neighbors who would never understand the depth of her turmoil, the rawness of her heart. She wore a mask of calm, a serene smile that hid the storm within, but inside she was unraveling, caught in a spiral of guilt and longing that threatened to consume her entirely. In moments of solitude she would close her eyes and imagine him, feel the memory of his touch, the warmth of his breath against her skin. She knew it was wrong, knew that each thought of him was another betrayal, yet she couldn't stop herself. It was as if her soul had been split in two, one half bound to the life she had always known, the other reaching out to him, to the forbidden freedom he represented. Amala knew that this path could only lead to heartbreak, that there would be a price to pay for the love she felt, a love that defied the boundaries of her world. Yet even as guilt clawed at her, even as the weight of her choices threatened to drown her, a part of her clung to that feeling, that spark of life that Kofi had awakened within her. She stood at her window, looking out over the land, her heart heavy with the burden of her secret. The night stretched out before her, vast and unforgiving, a mirror to the longing that burned within her. And in the stillness she whispered his name, a confession carried only by the darkness, a plea for the courage to face the truth of what she had become. Amala knew that she could not continue like this, torn between two worlds, her heart bound by the chains of guilt and desire. She would have to make a choice, to find a way to live with the consequences of her actions, to face the truth of her heart, no matter how painful it might be. But for now she lingered in the shadows, holding on to the memory of his touch, the warmth of his gaze, even as the guilt threatened to consume her. And as dawn broke on the horizon, Amal knew that her life could never be the same, that she had been forever changed by a love that defied explanation, a love that had both saved and destroyed her. Amal had spent countless sleepless nights wrestling with her feelings, but one evening a profound quiet settled within her. She understood now that she could no longer live divided, torn between the woman she had been and the woman she had become. The reality of her connection with Kofi had changed her in ways she could no longer ignore, and finally she felt ready to confront the truth, to acknowledge the love that had grown like roots within her heart, binding her to him in ways both beautiful and irreversible. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with the soft hues of dusk, Amal walked through her garden, each step feeling deliberate, like a journey toward herself. The familiar path, lined with flowers and shrubs she had tended for years, felt different tonight, each leaf, each petal whispering of memories and possibilities. She knelt down, her fingers brushing against the earth, grounding her in its cool, steady embrace. She had always found solace here, among the quiet, growing things, but tonight her garden held a different kind of peace. It was no longer a place to escape, it was a place to reflect, a place where she could lay down her fears and finally acknowledge the feelings she had carried so silently, so secretly. Her heart beat with a calm, steady rhythm as she let herself remember, as she allowed herself to relive every touch, every glance, every silent confession she had shared with Kofi. For so long she had been caught in the web of duty, bound to a life that had become a ritual of routine and expectation. She had accepted this as her fate, had convinced herself that contentment would one day settle in, like the soft dust that clung to her home after a dry season. But Kofi had shattered that illusion, had reminded her of the pulse of life, of the hunger for connection and love that she had buried deep within. His presence had awakened something dormant in her, something powerful and undeniable. And now, with the cool earth beneath her and the sky stretching out infinitely above, she allowed herself to accept it fully, without fear, without guilt. She could no longer deny the love that had blossomed within her, nor could she ignore the woman she had discovered through him, a woman who had the courage to feel, to desire, to live. In the stillness she felt her heart expand, a calm spreading through her like ripples across water. She knew that this love came with a cost, that it existed outside the bounds of her marriage, her vows, her past life. But in this moment she understood that love itself was not the betrayal. The betrayal would have been to deny herself, to deny the truth of her heart, to continue pretending that she was the same woman she had been before she met him. A soft breeze stirred the leaves, brushing her face, as if nature itself acknowledged her acceptance. She closed her eyes, feeling the coolness on her skin, a quiet blessing, a gentle reminder that life was as transient as the seasons, that everything changed, shifted, evolved. She understood now that her love for Kofi was part of that change, a chapter in the story of her life that would remain with her, no matter what path she chose. Amal knew that returning to her husband would be a choice made not from guilt, but from an understanding of who she had become. She could face him with a newfound honesty, no longer hiding behind a facade of compliance and routine. She could be the woman who had loved, who had let herself be vulnerable, and who had found the strength to acknowledge her desires. The next morning, as dawn broke over the village, she found herself standing by the bamboo fence, her fingers tracing its rough surface, each groove familiar yet strangely foreign, like a memory held in the body long after the mind has forgotten. She knew Kofi would not be there, that he would be working in his field, lost in his own world, but she felt his presence with her nonetheless, his quiet strength, his silent understanding. Amal closed her eyes, letting herself feel the weight of his absence, the ache of a love that could never be fully realized. But instead of pain, she felt a quiet acceptance, a peace that settled over her like a warm blanket, wrapping her in its gentle embrace. She had loved him deeply, and that love had given her something she hadn't known. She was missing, a sense of herself, a wholeness that she could carry forward. She took one last look at the garden, at the places where they had shared stolen glances and unspoken promises. Each corner held a memory, each plant a witness to their silent connection. But now she felt ready to let it go, to walk away without regret, carrying only the beauty of what they had shared within her. As Amal made her way back to her house, she felt lighter, as if a burden she hadn't realized she was carrying had been lifted. She understood that her love for Kofi was a part of her now, woven into the fabric of her being, but it did not have to define her or consume her. She could hold it close, a quiet ember glowing within her, warming her heart without demanding anything in return. That evening, when her husband returned from his trip, she greeted him with a smile that felt genuine, unforced. She looked at him with new eyes, seeing not just the man he was but the life they had built together, the shared moments, the quiet companionship that had, in its own way, sustained her. It was not the wild, consuming love she had felt with Kofi, but it was real, it was steady, and it was enough. As they sat together in the fading light, Amal felt a sense of peace settle over her, a calm that came from knowing who she was, from accepting the journey that had brought her to this moment. She knew she would always carry Kofi with her, that his presence would linger in her heart like a favorite song, a memory that would resurface in quiet moments, reminding her of the woman she had discovered within herself. But she also knew that she was strong enough to let him go, to walk forward with her head held high, unburdened by guilt or regret. She was not bound by the past, nor by the weight of unfulfilled dreams. She was free, truly free, to embrace the life before her, to live with an open heart, to be true to herself in ways she had never known before. And as the first stars appeared in the sky, Amal felt a quiet joy fill her, a joy that came not from possessing but from loving deeply, fiercely, without expectation or demand. She had loved, and she had learned to let go. And in that acceptance she found a new beginning, a place where peace and passion could coexist, where she could be both the woman who had loved and the woman who would continue forward, forever changed yet whole. Amal strolled through the village market with a basket in hand, attempting to lose herself in the familiar scents and sounds that surrounded her. The market was alive with vibrant colors and lively chatter as vendors called out, advertising everything from ripe mangoes to woven baskets. The hum of the crowd created a kind of cocoon, allowing her to drift between the stalls, her mind miles away. She had hoped the familiar sights would calm her racing thoughts, but even in this bustling space she couldn't escape the presence that lingered in her heart. And then she saw him. Kofi stood a few stalls away, engrossed in a conversation with a vendor. She could see his tall figure, his back turned, but even from this distance she felt his presence more acutely than ever. It was as if a current ran between them, invisible but undeniable, pulling her toward him in ways she could neither explain nor resist. Her breath caught, her heart thrumming in her chest as she watched him laugh softly at something the vendor had said. It was the kind of laugh that seemed to settle deeply within him, warm and genuine, a stark contrast to the restlessness she felt. Without realizing it, she took a step forward, her feet carrying her closer to him, her resolve weakening with each passing second. In a moment that felt both inevitable and surreal, Kofi turned, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. When his eyes found hers, Amal felt as though the entire market had faded into silence. His dark, steady gaze held her in place, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they had been dancing around. For a brief moment she felt exposed, as if he could see straight into her heart, into the conflicted, raw feelings she had hidden away. Kofi's expression softened, his lips curving into a gentle smile, one that sent a surge of warmth through her despite herself. The air between them thickened, humming with an energy that only they seemed to perceive. She could feel her pulse quickening, a mix of excitement and trepidation rising within her. This was a public space, yet she felt as if they were alone, caught in a private world where no one else existed. As if drawn by an invisible thread, Amal found herself moving closer, her feet carrying her forward with a mind of their own. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her basket, an unconscious attempt to steady herself against the waves of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. When she finally reached his side, she looked up at him, her lips parting slightly as if to speak, though no words came to mind. Amal, he said softly, her name rolling off his tongue with a warmth that wrapped around her like a comforting embrace. There was no need for pretense, no need for small talk. They stood there in a silence that was both heavy and soothing, as if everything they wanted to say was already understood. Kofi, she managed to reply, her voice barely above a whisper, yet filled with a vulnerability she couldn't conceal. She felt the heat rise to her cheeks as she looked down, suddenly aware of the crowd around them, the risk of being seen. But at that moment the world around her faded into irrelevance, leaving only the two of them suspended in a moment that felt both tender and forbidden. Kofi's gaze softened, and he gestured toward a quieter corner of the market, where a small stall selling dried herbs and handmade trinkets offered a semblance of privacy. Without a word, Amal followed him, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing with a mixture of excitement and fear. The crowd thinned as they moved to the edge of the market, the noise fading into a distant hum, leaving them in a quiet space where they could speak freely, if only for a moment. When they finally stopped, Kofi turned to her, his expression unreadable but intense, his eyes searching her face as if trying to understand what lay beneath the surface. "You seem distracted," he said gently, his voice low, yet filled with a concern that sent a shiver through her. It was such a simple observation, yet in his words she heard a depth of understanding that went beyond mere politeness. It was as if he could see the turmoil that churned within her, the longing and confusion she tried so desperately to hide. Amal looked away, her gaze falling to the dusty ground at her feet. "I've had a lot on my mind," she admitted, her voice barely audible, as if saying the words out loud would make them more real, more dangerous. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, patient, unyielding, a quiet presence that filled the space between them. Kofi took a step closer, his hand reaching out as if to touch her arm, but he stopped just short, his fingers hovering in the air before pulling back. The gesture, though restrained, sent a ripple of warmth through her, a reminder of the intimacy that lingered between them, unspoken but undeniably real. "I understand," he murmured, his voice soft yet filled with a sincerity that wrapped around her like a gentle embrace. "You don't have to explain. I feel it too." The words hung between them, a fragile confession that held more weight than anything they could have said outright. Amal looked up, her eyes meeting his, and in that moment she saw a reflection of her own emotions in his gaze, the longing, the hesitation, the fear of stepping into the unknown. It was a silent acknowledgement, a shared understanding that bound them together in ways that defied explanation. For a long moment they simply stood there, their eyes locked in a gaze that felt like both a question and an answer. She could feel the pull between them, a magnetic force that urged her to close the distance, to reach out, to give in to the feelings that simmered just beneath the surface. But even as her heart ached to bridge the gap, a voice in the back of her mind held her back, reminding her of the promises she had made, the life she had built. Kofi seemed to sense her inner turmoil, and he offered her a small, understanding smile, a look that conveyed both empathy and restraint. "Sometimes we find ourselves on paths we didn't expect," he said softly, his words laced with a wisdom that resonated deeply within her. "But that doesn't mean those paths are any less real." Amal's heart tightened at his words, a mixture of relief and sadness flooding her as she realized the truth in them. She felt the weight of her emotions settle over her, a bittersweet acceptance that brought both clarity and pain. She nodded slowly, her gaze falling once more, her voice barely a whisper as she replied, "I know." There was a long silence, one that held the weight of all they had left unsaid, all the feelings they could never fully express. Amal felt a tear prick at the corner of her eye, and she quickly turned away, unwilling to let him see the vulnerability that threatened to break through. But Kofi's hand reached out, gently brushing her shoulder, a touch so light and tender that it left her breathless. "Amal," he whispered, his voice filled with a warmth that seeped into her heart, soothing the ache that had settled there. She turned back to him, her gaze meeting his one final time, and in that look she felt a quiet promise, a vow that transcended words. She knew that whatever happened, whatever choices lay ahead, this moment would remain with her, a memory etched into her soul. With a soft, lingering smile, Kofi stepped back, his hand falling to his side as he turned to leave. Amal watched him go, her heart heavy yet filled with a sense of peace, a quiet acceptance of the love that had taken root within her, even if it could never fully bloom. And as he disappeared into the crowd, she knew that her life had been irrevocably changed, that she would carry this moment with her always, a secret whispered only to the wind. As she walked away, Amal felt both light and heavy, her heart aching with the knowledge that, despite the distance, despite the boundaries between them, she had found a connection that transcended the physical, a bond that would linger long after this day. And as she made her way through the market, the sights and sounds slowly returning to her senses, she allowed herself one final glance over her shoulder, a silent farewell to the man who had stirred her heart and awakened a part of her she had thought long forgotten. Amal made her way to the riverbank as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting a gentle, golden glow across the landscape. The world was quiet, cloaked in the stillness that only the early hours could bring. She hadn't been able to sleep, her thoughts tangled with memories of her encounter with Kofi in the marketplace, with the intensity of his gaze, the warmth of his voice, the quiet comfort of his presence. Each memory stirred a longing within her, a deep ache that she could neither explain nor resist. The air was cool, carrying the earthy scent of wet soil and the faint sweetness of morning blossoms. Amal knelt at the river's edge, her fingers brushing against the surface of the water, sending small ripples across its glassy reflection. She took a deep breath, feeling the fresh air fill her lungs, hoping it would quiet the thoughts that had consumed her. But no sooner had she closed her eyes than she felt that familiar, electric awareness that sent a shiver down her spine. She didn't have to look to know he was there. The warmth of his presence reached her before she even turned around, like the first rays of sun breaking through the mist. Slowly, she lifted her gaze, and there he was, standing just a few paces away, his silhouette softened by the dawn light, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. Kofi moved closer, his steps slow and deliberate, each one closing the distance between them. When he finally reached her, he knelt down beside her, his presence so near, so undeniably real, that Amal felt her breath catch. The silence between them was thick, charged with an unspoken tension that made the air feel heavy, almost tangible. She could feel his warmth, the steady beat of his presence, grounding her in a way she hadn't known she needed. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked softly, his voice low, rich, carrying a quiet strength that seemed to seep into her, calming the restless energy that had haunted her all night. Amal shook her head, her gaze falling to the river as she struggled to steady her breath. "No," she replied, her voice barely a whisper, her words catching in her throat. I needed some fresh air, I thought I'd be alone." Kofi's hand moved, so subtly that she almost didn't notice it, until his fingers brushed lightly against hers, sending a spark of warmth through her. His touch was gentle, hesitant, as if he, too, was aware of the boundaries they were dancing around. But in that small, fleeting contact, she felt a depth of emotion that took her breath away. "You're not alone," he murmured, his voice filled with a warmth that seemed to wrap around her, easing the tension that had settled in her chest. His fingers lingered on hers, a light touch, yet filled with a tenderness that made her heart race, made her pulse quicken in a way she could not ignore. She lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes, and in that moment everything else faded away. The river, the trees, the soft glow of dawn, they all became a distant blur as she lost herself in the depth of his gaze, in the warmth that radiated from him. She felt her heart hammering in her chest, her pulse quickening as he leaned closer, his face mere inches from hers, his breath warm against her skin. "Kofi," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and longing, her heart caught between the pull of her desire and the weight of her conscience. But as he lifted his hand, his fingers tracing a gentle line along her jaw, all her doubts melted away, replaced by a hunger that she could no longer deny. He looked at her, his gaze filled with a raw intensity that left her breathless, and in that moment she knew that there was no going back. Her resolve crumbled, her defenses fell, and before she knew it, she was reaching for him, her fingers curling around the back of his neck as she pulled him closer. Their lips met in a kiss that was both gentle and fierce, a release of all the emotions they had kept locked away, all the longing that had simmered between them in silence. His hands found her waist, pulling her against him as the world around them disappeared, leaving only the warmth of his embrace, the heat of his touch, the intensity of their connection. The kiss deepened, growing more urgent, more desperate, as if they were both trying to make up for all the time they had spent apart, all the moments they had denied themselves. Amal felt herself melting into him, her body pressing against his, her fingers tangled in his hair as their kisses grew hungrier, filled with a passion that left her dizzy, breathless. Kofi's hands moved up her back, his touch warm and steady, grounding her even as it sent shivers down her spine. She could feel his heart beat against hers, a steady, reassuring rhythm that matched her own, as if their bodies were in perfect harmony. Every touch, every kiss felt like a promise, a vow unspoken yet understood, a silent confession of the feelings they had both tried so hard to hide. They broke apart only when they were both breathless, their foreheads resting against each other as they caught their breath. Amal's heart raced, her skin tingling with the warmth of his touch, her mind swirling with a mixture of elation and fear. She looked up at him, her gaze filled with a vulnerability she could no longer conceal, and in his eyes she saw the same vulnerability mirrored back at her. "Amal," he murmured, his voice rough, filled with a depth of emotion that sent a shiver through her. He reached up, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing lightly over her skin. A touch so tender it brought tears to her eyes. "I don't want to hurt you. I don't want to make this harder for you." Amal shook her head, her hand covering his as she leaned into his touch, a quiet reassurance that she felt just as deeply as he did. "Kofi," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of everything she felt, "you're not hurting me. You're making me feel alive." The words hung between them, a quiet admission that carried a depth of meaning that went beyond anything they could say aloud. She felt his fingers tighten against her, his gaze softening as he looked at her, a warmth and understanding in his eyes that filled her heart with a quiet, fierce joy. They stayed like that, wrapped in each other's embrace, the dawn light casting a soft glow around them as the world slowly came to life. Amal felt a peace settle over her, a calm that went beyond words, a sense of belonging that she had never felt before. For the first time she felt as if she was exactly where she was meant to be, in the arms of a man who saw her, truly saw her, in ways no one else ever had. Eventually, as the sun rose higher, casting a warm golden light across the riverbank, they pulled apart, their fingers lingering in a silent farewell. Amal knew that this moment would end, that they would have to return to their separate lives, to the boundaries and expectations that held them apart. But as she looked at him, she felt a quiet certainty settle within her, a certainty that, no matter what happened, this moment, this connection, would stay with her, a part of her heart forever. With one last, lingering look, Kofi stepped back, his hand falling to his side, his gaze filled with a warmth and tenderness that took her breath away. Amal watched him go, her heart heavy yet filled with a quiet joy, a contentment that went beyond words. She knew that this love was forbidden, that it existed outside the boundaries of her life, yet it was a part of her now, a part of her soul that would stay with her, even in his absence. As she turned back to the river, the dawn light reflecting off the water, Amal felt a calm settle over her, a sense of peace that filled her with a quiet, fierce strength. She knew that this love, this connection, was something rare, something precious, something that would remain with her, no matter where life took her. And as she stood there watching the sunrise, she felt a sense of acceptance, a sense of clarity, a sense of purpose. In the stillness of the dawn, Amal knew that she had found something real, something true, something that would stay with her, forever etched into the fabric of her heart. And as she walked away from the riverbank, she carried that love with her, a quiet, fierce light that would guide her, no matter where life took her. The afternoon sun filtered softly through the hibiscus blossoms, casting a warm, dappled light across Amal's garden as her family gathered around her. The familiar laughter and voices of her cousins and aunts filled the air, a chorus of joy and warmth that usually brought Amal comfort. She moved among them, her hands busy passing plates of fresh fruit and pouring glasses of homemade juice, her smile steady, though her mind drifted elsewhere. Her mother sat on the wooden bench under the shade of a large jacaranda tree, her wise eyes watching the grandchildren chase each other around the garden with a gentle smile on her face. There was a sense of serenity in her posture, a calm that Amal had always admired but never quite understood. Her mother had lived her life within the village boundaries, caring for her family and finding contentment in the simple, predictable rhythm of her days. In her mother's presence, Amal felt both comforted and somehow confined, as if her own heart was being held back by the weight of expectations that ran as deep as the roots of the trees in her garden. "Amal, dear, why don't you sit with us for a moment?" her aunt called from a circle of chairs gathered near the vegetable patch. Amal forced herself to turn away from the hibiscus she had been absent-mindedly pruning, slipping the shears into her apron pocket as she joined her family. She took a seat beside her cousin Lindiwe, who had just returned from a trip to the capital and was eagerly recounting stories of city life. "Oh, Amal, you'd love the markets there. So many colors, so many people from all over," Lindiwe said, her eyes bright with excitement. "And the clothes. The patterns are unlike anything I've ever seen. It's like the city itself is alive, buzzing with energy." Amal listened, her smile unwavering, but a quiet ache tugged at her heart. The excitement in Lindui's voice reminded her of the passion she had glimpsed in herself, the longing for something beyond the boundaries of her garden, beyond the routines that had once defined her life. She glanced down at her hands, noting the rough patches on her fingers from hours of gardening, the small scars from years of tending to plants. There was beauty in her life, she knew, a simple beauty that many would envy, but lately it felt as if something essential was missing, something vibrant and untamed. Her husband's absence was notable among the group, a quiet omission that no one dared to comment on. He was always busy, always working, his mind constantly consumed by his job, by numbers and plans that had little to do with the world she inhabited. Even when he was home, he was distant, a presence that filled the house without truly being part of it. She had long ago made peace with his absence, had convinced herself that her life was complete with or without his attention. But now, with her family around her, she felt a hollow space within her heart, a space that longed for connection, for understanding, for something that went beyond duty and routine. As Lindui continued her stories, Amal felt her gaze drift to the bamboo fence that separated her garden from Kofi's. She knew he wouldn't be there, not during a family gathering, and yet a part of her hoped to catch a glimpse of him, to feel the quiet reassurance of his presence. The garden felt different now, transformed by the memories they had created, by the silent exchanges and shared glances that had come to mean so much to her. She had buried those feelings beneath layers of propriety and restraint, but now, surrounded by her family, they rose to the surface, filling her with a restlessness she couldn't ignore. Her aunt reached over, patting Amal's hand with a gentle smile. "You've done such a beautiful job with the garden, Amal. These flowers, these plants, they're like a part of you. I can see how much love you put into them." Amal returned her aunt's smile, but her heart felt heavy. The garden had indeed become a sanctuary for her, a place where she could pour her energy, her emotions, her frustrations. It was a labor of love, a quiet escape from the confines of her life, but it was also a reminder of the limits that held her back, of the dreams she had set aside in favor of practicality and duty. "It's my little world," she replied softly, her voice filled with a warmth that hid the ache beneath her words. "There's something comforting about watching things grow, about seeing the results of your work in something beautiful." Her cousin Tiboho chimed in, his voice teasing. "And what about the rest of life, Amal? Flowers are beautiful, but they don't replace everything else. Don't you ever feel like stepping out, seeing more of the world?" Amal's smile faltered for a brief second before she caught herself, keeping her tone light. "Maybe one day, Tiboho. For now I'm happy here." But as the words left her lips, she knew they weren't entirely true. The garden had been enough once, a space of peace and beauty, but now it felt like a cage, holding her within its boundaries while her heart yearned for something beyond. She glanced again toward the bamboo fence, a faint blush coloring her cheeks, as she recalled the fleeting moments she had shared with Kofi, moments that had reminded her of the depth of feeling she had long since buried. "Amal, are you all right?" Her mother's gentle voice cut through her thoughts, grounding her in the present. Amal looked up, meeting her mother's concerned gaze, and forced a reassuring smile. "Yes, Mama," she replied, her voice steady. "Just thinking about the garden." Her mother nodded, her expression softening. "It's good to think about the things that bring us peace, child. Life can be difficult, but there is strength in simplicity, in the beauty of everyday things." Amala swallowed, her mother's words settling over her like a gentle weight. There was truth in them, she knew, a wisdom that she had tried to follow her entire life. But as she looked around at her family, at the familiar faces and the warmth that had always filled her heart, she couldn't shake the feeling that something essential was missing, something that went beyond peace and simplicity. As the afternoon wore on, Amal excused herself, retreating to a quiet corner of the garden where the hibiscus bushes provided a semblance of privacy. She took a deep breath, her hand resting on the rough bark of the tree beside her, grounding herself in its steady presence. She closed her eyes, letting the sounds of her family fade into the background, allowing herself a moment of quiet introspection. In the silence, she could feel the weight of her heart, the quiet ache that had taken root there, a yearning for something she could barely name. She thought of Kofi, of the gentle strength in his gaze, the warmth of his presence, the silent understanding they had shared. She knew it was foolish to hold on to those moments, to let them fill the empty spaces in her heart, but she couldn't help it. They were a balm, a quiet reminder of a part of herself that had been dormant for so long. "Amal, come back. We're about to eat," her mother's voice called from across the garden, pulling her back to reality. Amal opened her eyes, taking one last, steadying breath before she returned to the gathering. She put on a smile, her expression warm and open, though a part of her remained distant, lost in the quiet space she had carved out within herself. As she joined her family, sitting down beside her mother and taking her hand, she felt a sense of peace settle over her, a peace tinged with melancholy. She loved them deeply, cherished each moment she spent with them, but she knew that part of her heart was wandering elsewhere, drawn to a connection that defied reason, that existed only in stolen glances and silent moments. The family meal began, voices blending together in laughter and familiar stories, filling the garden with a warmth that wrapped around her like a comforting embrace. Amal joined in, her laughter genuine, her love for her family clear, but deep down she felt a quiet loneliness, a sense of longing that could not be filled by the warmth of those around her. She looked around the table, at the faces of those she loved, and for a brief moment her gaze drifted back toward the fence, toward the place where her heart had found something new, something forbidden yet beautiful. And as she looked away, her heart heavy yet calm, she understood that her life would always be a balance between the love she had known and the love she had only just begun to discover. The sky hung heavy with dark clouds, an ominous weight pressing down on the village as the first rumbles of thunder echoed across the horizon. The air was thick and charged, a tangible anticipation of the coming storm, and Amal felt it resonate deep within her, mirroring the unrest that had taken root in her heart. She made her way toward the ancient baobab tree that stood at the edge of her land, its thick, gnarled branches stretching wide, as if to embrace the sky. The tree had always been a source of quiet strength, a witness to generations of stories, secrets, and silent wishes. As she reached the tree, a flash of lightning split the sky, illuminating the landscape in a brief, bright glow. Amal settled herself at the base of the trunk, resting her back against the rough bark, seeking comfort in the tree's unyielding presence. She could hear the first drops of rain pattering on the leaves above, a gentle sound that quickly grew into a steady drumbeat, blending with the distant growl of thunder. She closed her eyes, letting the rain wash over her, a quiet cleansing that seemed to soothe the restlessness within her, if only for a moment. But peace was elusive, slipping through her grasp like the rain running down her arms. As the wind picked up, carrying with it the fresh, earthy scent of wet soil, Amal's thoughts turned unbidden to Kofi. He had become a constant presence in her mind, a quiet, grounding force that lingered even in his absence. She thought of his steady gaze, his calming voice, the way he seemed to understand her without words. Being near him felt like standing in the eye of a storm, a place of calm amidst the chaos, a shelter she hadn't known she needed. Another clap of thunder shook the air, and Amal opened her eyes, her gaze falling on the wide expanse of land beyond the baobab. She could just make out the outline of the bamboo fence in the distance, blurred by the falling rain. She wondered if Kofi could feel the storm too, if he was somewhere nearby, sensing the same restless energy that seemed to hum through the very earth beneath her feet. The rain grew heavier, and Amal pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though it did little to shield her from the downpour. Yet she remained where she was, grounded by the rough texture of the baobab's bark, the coolness of the rain seeping into her skin, her heart beating in rhythm with the storm around her. She felt as though she were part of it, as if the storm's rage was an echo of her own turmoil, her own yearning for something beyond the life she knew. She thought of her husband, of the life they had built together, a life that had been safe, predictable, like the calm before the storm. She had been content, or so she had told herself. But lately, with every quiet moment she spent in her garden, with every stolen glance she exchanged with Kofi, her heart had begun to whisper of things she had kept buried, desires she had convinced herself were nothing more than foolish dreams. A gust of wind swept through the branches of the baobab, scattering raindrops across her face, and Amal looked up, her eyes tracing the lines of the tree's sprawling limbs. She felt a kinship with it, this tree that had withstood countless storms, yet still reached toward the sky, stretching ever outward, ever upward. She, too, felt as though she were reaching for something just out of her grasp, something that lingered on the edge of her consciousness, elusive and tantalizing. Lost in thought, Amal didn't hear the footsteps at first, the soft crunch of wet leaves underfoot as someone approached. It was only when she felt a shift in the air, a quiet presence that stirred the stillness around her, that she looked up, her heart skipping a beat as her eyes met Kofi's. He stood a few feet away, his figure framed by the shadow of the tree, rain dripping from his hair, his clothes soaked through. There was a calm in his gaze, a quiet understanding that seemed to reach out to her, grounding her in the midst of the storm. Neither of them spoke, yet the silence between them was filled with 1,000 unspoken words, 1,000 shared thoughts. It was as if he, too, had been drawn to this place, this tree, by the same restless energy that had brought her here. For a long moment they simply looked at each other, their breaths mingling with the rhythm of the rain, the steady pulse of the storm echoing in their hearts. Amal felt a sense of calm settle over her, a quiet reassurance in his presence, a reminder that she was not alone in her struggle, her longing, her fears. Kofi's gaze held hers, steady and unwavering, and in that look she found a strength she hadn't known she possessed. Finally he took a step back, his eyes never leaving hers, a silent acknowledgement that he understood, that he would be there no matter what path she chose, no matter what storms she faced. With a gentle nod he turned and walked away, his figure fading into the rain, leaving her alone beneath the sheltering branches of the baobab. Amal watched him go, her heart both heavy and light, a strange mixture of sorrow and peace settling within her. She knew that the path before her was uncertain, that the storm within her would not easily pass. But as she leaned back against the tree, letting the rain wash over her, she felt a quiet resolve take root, a determination to face whatever lay ahead with strength and honesty. As the storm raged on, Amal sat beneath the baobab, her heart a steady beat in the midst of the chaos, a quiet promise to herself that she would find her way, no matter where it might lead. Amal stood atop the hills overlooking the village, the sun dipping low on the horizon, casting the landscape in hues of amber and deepening purple. The sight was breathtaking, the sky a canvas of colors that stretched wide and endless, and for a brief moment she felt herself drawn into its vastness, her worries seeming to fade into the distance. The evening air was cool, carrying with it the soft, earthy scent of grass and wildflowers that dotted the hillside. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply, letting the serenity of the moment seep into her, quieting the restlessness that had taken hold of her heart. From here the village seemed so small, a collection of familiar rooftops nestled within the embrace of the land, its pathways winding like thin veins through the soil. It was a place she had always known, a place that had been her entire world, yet as she stood there, watching the sun sink lower, she felt a pang of longing for something she couldn't quite name. The sound of footsteps startled her, and she turned to see Kofi making his way up the hill, his silhouette framed against the backdrop of the fading sun. He moved with a quiet grace, his steps unhurried, as if he too was in no rush to disturb the tranquility of the evening. Amal felt a flutter of surprise and something else, a quiet comfort in seeing him here, as if he belonged to this moment just as much as she did. He approached slowly, stopping a few paces away, his gaze fixed on the horizon. They stood side by side in silence, their presence together feeling natural, unforced. She glanced at him, noting the way his expression softened in the golden light, a quiet strength radiating from him that seemed to ground her, calming the storm that had raged within her for so long. "You come here often?" he asked, his voice low, blending seamlessly with the gentle rustle of the breeze that swept across the hill. Amal nodded, her gaze drifting back to the village below. "Sometimes. It's quiet here." Away from everything, she paused, choosing her words carefully. "It feels freeing." Kofi nodded in understanding, his eyes tracing the contours of the hills, the winding path that led back to the village. "There's something about being up here," he murmured. "It reminds you of how small everything is, how even the biggest worries can seem less when you look at them from above." Amal's heart tightened at his words, the truth in them striking a chord deep within her. She had often thought the same, though she had never voiced it aloud. Being up here, surrounded by open sky and sweeping hills, made her feel as though she were part of something vast and timeless, a part of the earth itself, yet free from the confines that had defined her life. They stood together in silence, watching as the last rays of sunlight cast a warm glow over the village, each lost in their own thoughts. Amal felt an unspoken understanding pass between them, a quiet acknowledgement of the journeys they were both on, the paths that had somehow brought them here, to this moment on the hill. "Kofi," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "do you ever wonder what else is out there? Beyond the village, beyond everything we know?" He turned to look at her, his gaze thoughtful, reflective. "Yes," he replied after a moment, his voice filled with a quiet conviction. "I think about it often. The world is vast, filled with things we can't even imagine." He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "But sometimes it's not the place that matters, it's the feeling, the sense of purpose, of connection." Amal felt a warmth spread through her at his words, a gentle reassurance that settled over her like a soft blanket. She had always thought her longing was a desire to escape, to break free from the life she had known, but perhaps she realized it was something deeper, a desire for connection, for understanding, for a sense of belonging that went beyond the familiar. As the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the land, Amal felt a sense of peace settle over her, a quiet acceptance of the uncertainties that lay ahead. She knew that her journey was far from over, that there were choices yet to be made, but for the first time she felt ready to face them, to embrace whatever came next with an open heart. Kofi reached out, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder, a simple gesture of solidarity, of support. She looked up at him, a small, genuine smile curving her lips as she met his gaze, and in that moment she felt a quiet strength flow between them, a silent vow that whatever paths they chose, they would face them with courage, with honesty, with a newfound clarity. The last light of day faded, and as they turned to make their way back down the hill, Amal felt lighter, her heart no longer weighed down by doubt and fear. She felt as though she had glimpsed something true, something she had been searching for, and it filled her with a quiet joy, a sense of purpose that would guide her forward. Together they walked back to the village, their footsteps quiet against the soft earth, two souls moving through the dusk, united by the same unspoken hope, a hope that whatever lay beyond the horizon would be met with open hearts and steady resolve. Amal stepped into her garden, just as the first light of dawn brushed the tops of the hibiscus blooms with a soft, golden hue. She paused at the edge of the pathway, taking in the familiar sight that had been both her sanctuary and her prison. The garden was quiet, its plants still heavy with morning dew, each leaf and petal seeming to glow in the gentle light. It was as if the garden was holding its breath, waiting for her to come back to it fully, to once again find comfort in the life she had created here. Slowly she walked along the path, her fingers trailing over the delicate flowers that she had tended with such care. Every corner of the garden held memories, each plant a witness to her days spent here, her thoughts, her dreams, her quiet moments of reflection. She let her hand rest on the rough bark of a small acacia tree she had planted years ago, its branches now spreading wide, reaching toward the sky. It was a silent reminder of how time had passed, of how she, too, had grown, changed, reaching for something beyond her grasp. As she moved further into the garden, Amal felt a strange calm settle over her, a gentle acceptance of the journey she had taken, of the choices she had yet to make. The garden, once her escape, had come to mean so much more. It was a space she had poured her heart into, a place where she could be herself, away from the expectations and routines of her everyday life. But today it felt different. She no longer saw it as a boundary, a fence that kept her desires and dreams enclosed. Instead, it felt like a place of possibility, a blank canvas where she could begin anew. She knelt by the vegetable patch, the soil cool and damp beneath her fingers. Here, in this simple act of tending to the earth, she felt a connection to something deeper, a quiet power in nurturing life, in creating something beautiful and lasting. Amal dug her fingers into the soil, letting it crumble between her hands, grounding her, connecting her to the roots she had set down, roots that had grown and strengthened over time. Her thoughts turned to the quiet moments she had shared with Kofi, to the silent understanding that had passed between them. Those memories were like seeds planted deep within her, seeds that had blossomed into an awareness of her own heart, of her own desires. She knew that what they shared could never fully be, that their connection existed outside the boundaries of her life, yet it had brought her to a place of clarity, a place where she could finally face herself without fear. She glanced over at the bamboo fence that separated her garden from Kofi's. There was a time when she had looked at it as a barrier, a reminder of the distance between them, but now it seemed less imposing, as though it had become a symbol of all that was possible, of the quiet strength she had found within herself. She no longer felt the longing that had once gripped her so tightly, the need to reach beyond her life. Instead, she felt a quiet satisfaction, a peace that came from knowing herself more deeply, from understanding that she could love, could feel, without losing herself. Amal arose, brushing the soil from her hands as she turned her gaze to the hibiscus bushes that lined the path. The blooms were vibrant, full of life, their colors rich and deep, a reminder of the beauty she had cultivated here. She smiled softly, her heart filling with a gentle pride, a quiet appreciation for the life she had built, for the love and care she had poured into this garden, into herself. Walking slowly, she made her way back to the center of the garden, where a small bench sat beneath the wide branches of a jacaranda tree. She took a seat, letting the early morning light warm her face, her gaze drifting over the familiar sights, each one a reminder of the journey she had taken. She knew now that she didn't need to escape her life, didn't need to chase something outside of herself to find fulfillment. The peace she sought was already here, within her, rooted as deeply as the plants that surrounded her. For a long time she sat in silence, listening to the sounds of the garden coming to life with the dawn. Birds flitted through the trees, their songs blending with the soft rustling of leaves, creating a symphony that filled her with a quiet joy. She felt whole, complete, as though she had found a part of herself that had been missing, a part she had discovered in the unspoken moments, in the silent glances, in the depths of her own heart. As the sun rose higher, casting warm rays across the garden, Amal took one last look at the bamboo fence, a soft smile playing on her lips. She felt gratitude, not only for the connection she had found with Kofi, but for the way it had brought her back to herself, for the strength it had awakened within her. She knew that she would carry that connection with her, a quiet flame that would warm her heart even in the most ordinary days. With a deep breath she stood, feeling the soft earth beneath her feet, the warmth of the sun on her skin, the gentle embrace of the life she had created here. The garden was no longer just a sanctuary, it was a part of her, a reflection of all she had become, all she would continue to be. As she walked back toward the house, Amal felt a calm settle over her, a peace that came from knowing that she was enough, that her life, her choices, her journey were all her own. She was ready to move forward, to embrace the life she had chosen, with an open heart and a newfound clarity. And as the garden faded behind her, she carried with her a quiet strength, a gentle resilience, a love that needed no boundaries, no labels, only the simple, steady rhythm of her own heart. The village library was a small, unassuming building, tucked away on a quiet side street, with large wooden doors that creaked as Amal gently pushed one open. She slipped inside, eager for the silence and comfort that the rows of books provided. The scent of old paper and ink filled the space, calming her as she moved through the narrow aisles, trailing her fingers over the spines of countless books. The world outside felt so noisy, so turbulent with thoughts and emotions she couldn't escape. But here, within these walls, there was a calm that washed over her, allowing her mind to breathe. Amal found herself drawn to a small reading nook near the back of the library. Light filtered through a dusty window, casting warm, amber tones over the pages of a worn book she had pulled from the shelf. She sank into a cushioned chair, tucking her feet beneath her, and opened the book, letting her gaze wander over the faded text. Words became images in her mind, and she felt herself being transported into the stories of distant lands and forgotten times. Here, surrounded by tales of people who had lived and loved long ago, she could almost forget her own restless thoughts. The silence was punctuated only by the occasional turn of a page, the faint whisper of footsteps on the wooden floor, and the creak of bookshelves settling into the building's ancient frame. It was in one of these rare moments, as she shifted slightly to find a more comfortable position, that she noticed a familiar presence. At first she thought it was her mind playing tricks on her, conjuring a figure she had thought of often in the past days. She resisted the urge to look, telling herself she was mistaken, that it was impossible for him to be here, of all places at this exact moment. But the pull was irresistible. Slowly, as if in a dream, Amal lifted her gaze, peeking over the top of her book, and her breath caught in her throat. There, just a few shelves away, Kofi stood, his back to her, his broad shoulders framed by the soft light from the window. He was reaching for a book on a high shelf, his fingers brushing over the worn covers as he browsed with a quiet concentration. She felt a pang in her chest, an ache that had become so familiar, so much a part of her, that she hardly noticed it anymore. In the stillness she watched him, her gaze tracing the curve of his profile as he turned slightly, flipping through the pages of a book he had pulled down. His brow furrowed in that quiet, thoughtful way she had come to recognize, a small gesture that spoke of his love for the details, for the small, quiet moments that others often overlooked. She found herself captivated, unable to look away, her mind filling with memories of fleeting glances, shared silences and unspoken words that lingered between them like shadows. For a moment she thought of leaving, of quietly slipping away before he noticed her. But something held her in place, some quiet, powerful force that kept her rooted to her chair. She knew she couldn't keep avoiding him forever, couldn't keep pretending that what she felt was nothing more than a passing fancy. The feelings that had taken root in her heart had grown into something more, something she couldn't easily dismiss or ignore. And so she remained, allowing herself the luxury of this brief, stolen moment. At last Kofi's gaze lifted, his eyes scanning the room before they settled on her. His expression softened, a slight surprise flickering across his face before it was replaced by a look of understanding, of shared recognition. There were no words, no smiles, only a quiet acknowledgement that passed between them, a silent understanding that seemed to bridge the space that separated them. Amal felt her heart beat faster, her hands clutching the edges of her book as she held his gaze. He moved toward her, his steps slow and measured, as if he too were savoring this unexpected encounter. She watched him approach, feeling a strange mix of anticipation and dread, her mind racing with questions she knew she would never voice. When he finally stopped, it was at a respectful distance, his presence close enough to fill the air around her with a warmth that she could feel, even without him touching her. Kofi's gaze fell to the book in her hands, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he recognized the title. She felt her cheeks flush, a quiet embarrassment blooming within her, though she couldn't say why. He gestured toward the chair across from her, a silent question in his eyes, and she nodded, her heart thudding in her chest as he settled into the seat opposite her. For a long time neither of them spoke. The silence between them was rich, filled with all the things they couldn't say, with feelings that hovered on the edge of words but never fully emerged. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, the quiet intensity of his presence, grounding her in a way she hadn't expected. She lowered her eyes, focusing on the pages in front of her, though the words blurred into meaningless shapes as her mind became acutely aware of the man sitting across from her. Kofi turned a page of his own book, the soft rustle breaking the stillness between them, but he didn't look up. There was something calming in the way he remained there, content to simply share the space with her, to exist within the same quiet moment without the need for conversation. She felt a strange sense of peace settle over her, a comfort in the simplicity of his presence, in the way they could sit together in silence without the need to fill the air with meaningless words. Her thoughts drifted as she studied the lines of his face, the way his eyes traced the text before him with a focus that belied the softness in his expression. She wondered what thoughts filled his mind, what emotions lay beneath the calm exterior he presented to the world. She wished for just a moment that she could reach across the space between them, that she could bridge the quiet gulf that separated them, and ask him all the questions that lingered in her heart. But she knew that some things were better left unspoken, that some feelings were too fragile, too precious to be exposed to the harshness of reality. And so she remained silent, allowing herself the simple pleasure of this moment, of sitting across from him in the quiet sanctuary of the library, with only the gentle rustle of pages to break the stillness. As time passed, the light outside began to soften, casting warm shadows across the room, and she felt the weight of the day settle over her, a quiet sense of contentment filling her heart. She didn't know what the future held, didn't know where life would lead her or what choices she would ultimately make. But in this moment, in the soft light of the library, she felt a sense of peace, a gentle acceptance of the connection that bound her to him, even if they would never speak of it aloud. When Kofi finally closed his book, he looked up, his eyes meeting hers with a warmth that sent a shiver through her. There was no need for words, no need for confessions or promises. In that brief glance, she felt as if he had seen straight into her heart, as if he understood the depth of her feelings without the need for explanation. She held his gaze, her own eyes filled with a quiet vulnerability, a silent acknowledgement of all that lay between them. With a small, almost imperceptible nod, he rose from his seat, giving her one last lingering look before he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadowed aisles of the library. She watched him go, her heart heavy and light at the same time, a quiet ache settling within her as she realized that this moment, like so many before it, was fleeting, a brief encounter in a life filled with unspoken emotions and silent connections. Amala remained in her seat long after he had gone, her gaze drifting to the empty chair across from her, a wistful smile touching her lips. She knew that this moment, this quiet, stolen memory, would remain with her, a secret treasure that she would carry in her heart, a quiet reminder of the bond they shared, a bond that defied explanation and transcended words. In the fading light of the library, Amal felt a sense of peace settle over her, a gentle acceptance of the love that would linger between them, a love that needed no words, no promises, only the quiet, unspoken connection that would remain with her, even as the world around her continued to change. Late in the evening, the storm raged over the village, a fierce, unrelenting force that sent the residents rushing indoors and windows slamming shut against the gusting wind. Rain fell in torrents, the drops heavy and cold, drenching the earth and creating rivulets that carved their way through the streets. Amal had found shelter at the village inn, a cozy, rustic building with thick stone walls and a hearth that crackled with warmth. She hadn't planned to be here tonight, but the storm had come on suddenly, catching her just as she was about to leave the village centre. Now, she stood in the quiet corner of the inn's lounge, her shawl soaked and clinging to her skin, her heart still racing from the sprint to safety. The fire in the hearth cast a warm, golden light that flickered over the worn leather chairs and the wooden table scattered throughout the room. She removed her shawl, draping it over the back of a nearby chair to dry, and smoothed her hair with trembling fingers, feeling the lingering chill of the rain clinging to her skin. Despite the warmth of the fire, A shiver ran down her spine, an inexplicable tension lingering in the air. The inn was almost empty, save for a few travellers huddled in conversation near the bar, their voices low against the steady drumbeat of rain against the windows. Amal took a seat near the fire, pulling her knees up to her chest and letting the warmth seep into her bones. She had just begun to relax when the door creaked open, letting in a gust of cold, damp air. She looked up, her eyes widening as she saw him. Kofi stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the rain-soaked night. His clothes were damp, his hair clinging to his forehead, and his gaze scanned the room before settling on her. For a moment neither of them moved, each caught off guard by the unexpected encounter. Her heart raced, her pulse thrumming in her veins as he took a step forward, his presence filling the small space with an intensity that was almost palpable. Without a word, Kofi moved to the chair beside hers, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he too were feeling the weight of the moment. He sank into the seat, his eyes never leaving hers, a quiet acknowledgement passing between them. The silence hung heavy, charged with an electricity that was almost tangible, a current that seemed to crackle in the air between them. Outside, the storm continued to rage, the thunder rolling across the sky like a distant drum, the lightning illuminating the room in brief flashes of white light. Amal could feel the heat of the fire warming her, mingling with the warmth radiating from Kofi's proximity, creating a sensation that was both soothing and exhilarating. She felt her pulse quicken, her breath catching as she became acutely aware of every detail, the way the light danced over his skin, the glint of moisture on his jawline, the quiet intensity in his gaze. Kofi leaned back, his gaze still fixed on her, his presence steady and grounding, yet there was something different tonight. A softness in his eyes, a quiet vulnerability that she hadn't seen before. She felt her own defenses slipping, the walls she had carefully constructed to protect her heart beginning to crumble under the weight of his gaze. She turned her face toward the fire, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she tried to steady her breath, to calm the wild flutter of her heart. But the silence stretched on, growing heavier with each passing moment, until it became almost unbearable. She could feel his gaze on her, feel the warmth of his body mere inches away, and yet the distance between them felt insurmountable, a chasm that she couldn't bring herself to cross. She didn't dare look at him, didn't dare let him see the longing that had taken root within her heart, a longing that she could no longer deny, no matter how hard she tried. The fire crackled, sending sparks dancing into the air, and Amal felt a warmth that went beyond the physical, a heat that seemed to burn through her, igniting something deep within her soul. She stole a glance at him, her gaze lingering on the curve of his mouth, the way his hand rested on the arm of the chair, strong and steady, yet softened by the golden light. Without thinking, her hand moved, her fingers reaching out, hesitant but compelled, as if drawn by an invisible force. She barely brushed the edge of his sleeve, the fabric damp and cool beneath her fingertips, but the touch was enough to send a shiver through her. Kofi's gaze darkened, his eyes following the movement of her hand, a flicker of something raw and unguarded passing over his features. He reached up, his fingers grazing hers in a touch so light it felt almost like a whisper, a question, a confession that neither of them could put into words. She didn't pull away, couldn't bring herself to break the fragile connection between them. Her hand lingered on his, her fingers tracing a gentle line along his knuckles, feeling the roughness of his skin, the quiet strength in his grip. She knew this was dangerous, knew that they were treading a line they could never cross, but in that moment she didn't care. All that mattered was the warmth of his hand beneath hers, the way his gaze held hers with a fierce, unspoken intensity. The storm outside grew fiercer, the wind howling against the windows, as if echoing the turmoil within her heart. Kofi's hand tightened around hers, his fingers intertwining with hers, a quiet promise, a vow unspoken yet understood. She felt her breath hitch, her heart pounding as he leaned closer, his gaze never wavering, his presence filling her senses, consuming her in a way that left her dizzy, breathless. In the flickering light of the fire, their faces were mere inches apart, their breaths mingling in the small space that separated them. Amal felt her eyes close, surrendering to the sensation of his warmth, his presence, the quiet strength of his touch. She felt his hand move to her cheek, his thumb brushing lightly over her skin, a touch so gentle it sent a shiver down her spine, a warmth that seemed to seep into her very soul. She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze with a vulnerability she couldn't hide, a raw honesty that she had kept buried for so long. In that moment there was no need for words, no need for explanations or justifications. They were simply two souls, bound by a connection that defied reason, a bond that existed beyond the boundaries of their lives, beyond the expectations and responsibilities that held them apart. His gaze softened, his lips curving into a small, almost sad smile as he held her face in his hands, his touch steady and grounding. She felt her own resolve waver, felt the weight of her emotions pressing down on her, the ache in her heart growing stronger, more insistent, as she realized just how much he meant to her, how deeply he had become a part of her life. Without a word, Kofi leaned in, his lips brushing against hers in a kiss so soft, so tender, it felt like a dream. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the warmth of his embrace, to the quiet intensity of his touch. The world around them faded into silence, the storm outside a distant murmur as they lost themselves in each other, in the warmth and comfort of a connection that felt both forbidden and inevitable. They pulled away slowly, their foreheads resting against each other as they caught their breath, their hands still intertwined, their hearts beating in time with the rhythm of the storm. Amal felt a tear slip down her cheek, a mixture of joy and sorrow, of longing and acceptance, as she realized that this moment, this brief stolen memory, would remain with her forever, a quiet treasure hidden deep within her heart. They sat like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's presence, a silent acknowledgement of the love that lingered between them, a love that needed no words, no promises, only the quiet understanding that they would carry this moment with them. A secret shared only by the flickering light of the fire and the storm that raged outside. As the storm began to ease, the rain slowing to a gentle patter against the windows, Kofi released her hand, his gaze lingering on her face, a quiet sadness in his eyes. She felt a pang in her heart, a bittersweet ache, as he rose from his seat, his movements slow and reluctant, as if he too felt the weight of their parting. Without a word he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the inn, leaving her alone by the fire, her heart heavy yet filled with a quiet, fierce joy. She knew that this love, this connection was something rare, something precious, something that would remain with her, no matter where life took her. As the fire crackled softly in the quiet of the inn, Amal leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes and letting the warmth of the flames wash over her. A silent reminder of the love that had touched her heart, a love that would linger, hidden yet cherished, for all the days to come. The morning sun had barely risen, casting a soft, silvery light over the forest path as Amal stepped into its embrace. The world was quiet, still wrapped in the tranquility of dawn, with only the occasional bird calling out through the trees. She walked slowly, her steps muffled by the soft carpet of leaves beneath her feet, her senses attuned to the subtle sounds around her, the rustling of leaves, the gentle hum of a breeze, the steady rhythm of her own heartbeat. The forest had always been a place of peace for Amal, a sanctuary where she could lose herself among the ancient trees and escape the weight of her daily life. But today something felt different. There was an energy in the air, a quiet anticipation that seemed to pulse through the trees and linger in the morning mist. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the earthy scent of damp soil and moss, letting the calm of the forest seep into her. As she rounded a bend in the path, a figure emerged from the mist ahead. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized the tall, familiar silhouette standing among the trees, his gaze already fixed on her. Kofi. It was as if he had been waiting for her, drawn here by the same invisible thread that had guided her steps to this place. For a moment, neither of them moved, each caught in the quiet intensity of the other's gaze. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the leaves stilling, the air thickening around them as they stood there, separated by only a few paces but connected by something deeper, something that defied explanation. Slowly, as if moving through a dream, Amal took a step forward. She felt her heart racing, her pulse quickening with each step, the warmth of his presence pulling her closer, filling her senses with a heady mix of anticipation and longing. She hadn't expected to see him here, hadn't prepared herself for the effect his presence would have on her, but there was no turning back now. Kofi held her gaze, his eyes dark and intense, his expression unreadable yet filled with a quiet magnetic pull that left her breathless. She could feel the warmth of him, sense the steady strength in his stance, and yet there was a softness in his face, a vulnerability that tugged at something deep within her. They stood facing each other in silence, the world around them fading into the background as their eyes locked. She felt as if he could see straight into her heart, straight into the secret corners of her soul, where she had hidden her feelings, her desires, her fears. It was both thrilling and terrifying, this sense of being seen, of being known, and yet she couldn't look away. Without thinking, she lifted her hand, reaching out to touch him, her fingers brushing against the rough fabric of his shirt. The contact sent a spark through her, a surge of warmth that spread through her body, igniting something she had kept buried for too long. She felt his hand cover hers, his fingers warm and steady against her skin, grounding her, anchoring her in the reality of this moment. He didn't speak, didn't break the silence that enveloped them, but his gaze held 1,000 unspoken words, a quiet promise that echoed in the depths of his eyes. She felt her breath catch as he drew her closer, his hand moving to rest gently on her shoulder, his touch a silent reassurance, a steadying force amidst the rush of emotions swirling within her. Amal closed her eyes, surrendering to the warmth of his touch, the strength in his embrace, allowing herself to be held, to be seen, to be cherished in a way she had never allowed herself before. She could feel his breath on her skin, warm and soft, sending a shiver down her spine as he leaned closer, his presence filling her senses, consuming her in a way that left her dizzy, breathless. They stood there, entwined in the stillness of the forest, their breaths mingling in the cool morning air, their bodies pressed close, fitting together as if they had been made for this moment, this quiet embrace. She could feel his heart beating in time with hers, a steady rhythm that grounded her, that reminded her of the strength, the comfort, the quiet intensity that he brought into her life. As if sensing her thoughts, Kofi's hand moved, his fingers brushing lightly along her jawline, tracing a gentle path that left a trail of warmth in its wake. She felt herself leaning into his touch, her own hands resting on his shoulders, feeling the solid warmth of him beneath her fingers. There was a tenderness in his gaze, a quiet, unspoken affection that filled her with a fierce, aching joy. She didn't need words, didn't need explanations or promises. In his touch, in the quiet strength of his embrace, she found everything she needed, a silent reassurance that they were bound by something deeper, something unbreakable. She felt his lips press softly against her forehead, a gentle kiss that sent a wave of warmth through her, filling her heart with a quiet, fierce happiness that left her breathless. They stood together in the morning light, wrapped in each other's arms, their bodies pressed close, their hearts beating in time with the rhythm of the forest. Amal felt a peace settle over her, a calm that went beyond words, a sense of belonging that she had never felt before. She knew that this moment would remain with her, a quiet memory that would linger in her heart, a reminder of the connection that had brought them together, a bond that would endure no matter where life took them. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, casting a warm, golden light over them, Amal lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes with a smile that was both tender and fierce. She felt a surge of gratitude, a quiet joy that filled her heart as she realized that, no matter what lay ahead, she would carry this moment with her, a memory etched into her soul. They lingered in each other's embrace, wrapped in the warmth of the morning, the quiet strength of their connection, a love that needed no words, only the silent understanding that bound them together, forever entwined in the beauty of the forest and the dawn of a new day. The evening festival by the lake was alive with color and laughter, a celebration that filled the air with music and the warm glow of lanterns hanging from tree branches. Their light cast dancing reflections across the water, painting a vivid tapestry that shifted with every ripple and wave. Amal stood at the edge of the lake, taking it all in, the joyful voices, the clinking of glasses, the soft strumming of a guitar in the distance. Yet, in the midst of it all, she felt a familiar restlessness, a quiet ache that seemed to pulse beneath the surface, an anticipation that had settled into her very bones. She turned, feeling her heart skip as she saw Kofi standing just a few steps away, his figure silhouetted against the lake, his face softened in the warm glow of the festival lights. His gaze was already on her, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, an invitation unspoken but undeniable. For a moment she forgot the crowd around them, forgot the music, the laughter, everything but the intensity of his presence, the magnetic pull that had drawn her to him over and over again. Without a word, he gestured toward a quieter spot near the lake's edge, a secluded corner where the music faded to a distant hum, and the shadows fell in soft, gentle patterns over the grass. She followed him, her heart pounding as they walked side by side, their fingers brushing in a subtle, electric touch that sent a thrill through her, setting her nerves alight. When they reached the edge of the water, Kofi stopped, his gaze fixed on the dark expanse of the lake stretching out before them. The air was cool, a faint breeze drifting over the surface of the water, carrying with it the scent of night blooming flowers. Amal felt a shiver run down her spine, a mixture of the evening chill and the undeniable warmth radiating from his presence. They stood in silence, their breaths mingling in the cool air, the only sound the gentle lapping of water against the shore. Amal felt the weight of his gaze on her, the intensity of his eyes as they traced her face, her shoulders, the curve of her arm. She felt exposed, vulnerable under the quiet power of his attention, but she couldn't bring herself to look away. There was a hunger in his gaze, a quiet yearning that mirrored her own, a desire that simmered just beneath the surface. Kofi reached for her hand, his touch light, almost tentative, as if testing the boundaries of the moment. She felt his fingers entwine with hers, a warmth that spread through her, anchoring her, grounding her in the reality of his presence. Her pulse quickened, her breath shallow as he pulled her closer, his hand finding its way to her waist, a steady, comforting touch that sent a thrill through her, igniting a heat that had lingered in her heart for too long. They stood like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms, their faces mere inches apart, their breaths mingling in the cool night air. She could feel his heartbeat against hers, a steady rhythm that echoed the intensity of her own, a silent confession that needed no words. The world around them faded into silence, leaving only the warmth of his body pressed against hers, the quiet strength of his embrace, the undeniable pull that had drawn them together time and again. Slowly, as if unable to resist, Kofi leaned closer, his lips brushing against her forehead in a tender, lingering kiss that sent a shiver through her. His touch was gentle, reverent, filled with a tenderness that took her breath away, a quiet promise that echoed in the depth of his gaze. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the warmth of his embrace, to the quiet intensity of his touch, letting herself be swept away in the depth of her feelings, the fierce joy that filled her heart. They stood together by the lake, wrapped in the warmth of the evening, the beauty of the festival fading into the background as they lost themselves in each other, in the quiet magic of the night, in a connection that defied words, that needed no explanations. Only the silent understanding that bound them together, a bond as deep and enduring as the lake itself. The village courtyard was bathed in silver moonlight, the only illumination against the deep, inky darkness of midnight. Amal walked slowly, her footsteps echoing softly over the cobblestone path. She had come here for solitude, for the quiet that only these late hours could bring, hoping the chill night air would soothe the unrest that had lingered within her all evening. The courtyard was empty, silent except for the whisper of leaves rustling in the faint breeze, their shadows shifting like delicate lace patterns over the walls. But as she moved deeper into the courtyard, she sensed she wasn't alone. She halted, a familiar, undeniable presence reaching her even before she saw him. Kofi stepped out from the shadows of a nearby archway, his tall figure bathed in moonlight, his gaze intense and steady as it met hers. The air between them thickened, a quiet current flowing, an energy that seemed to stir the night itself. For a moment neither of them moved, their eyes locked in a gaze that held more weight than any words could carry. Amal felt her breath catch, her heart racing as he took a step closer, his movements slow and deliberate, each one heightening the pulse she felt deep within her chest. She had been searching for peace, yet his presence stirred something entirely different, a warmth that crept into her bones, igniting a fire she couldn't ignore. Kofi stopped just inches away, his gaze holding hers, a quiet intensity simmering behind his dark eyes. The silence stretched between them, fraught with the unspoken, with the desires they had buried for so long. Amal felt the cool night air wrap around them, a contrast to the heat radiating from his presence, an energy that seemed to bind them together in a way that words could never capture. Slowly he lifted a hand, his fingers grazing her cheek with a touch so gentle it felt like a whisper against her skin. She felt herself lean into his touch, her eyes closing as his thumb brushed over her cheekbone, a silent reassurance, a quiet confession of all he could not say. Her heart pounded, her breath shallow, the simple act of his touch unraveling the restraint she had held for so long. She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze once more, and in that moment everything else faded away, the village, the courtyard, the world itself. There was only the two of them, standing together under the moonlight, bound by a connection that defied explanation, that existed beyond the bounds of reason. Without a word, Kofi slipped his hand to the nape of her neck, pulling her closer until their foreheads touched. She could feel his breath, warm against her skin, mingling with hers, their breaths falling into a shared rhythm. The moment felt fragile, a delicate balance between the desires they both felt and the boundaries they knew they couldn't cross. But in that moment, boundaries felt inconsequential, lost in the pull that held them together. Amal's hand found its way to his chest, her fingers splayed against the warmth of his skin, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. The intimacy of the touch, the closeness of their bodies, left her breathless, every fibre of her being attuned to him, to the quiet strength in his embrace. She felt his heartbeat quicken beneath her touch, a silent confirmation of the effect she had on him, a reminder that he felt it too, this pull, this connection that had haunted her every thought. Kofi's lips brushed her temple, a feather-like touch that sent a shiver through her, a thrill that spread through her entire being. He moved slowly, his lips tracing a path down to her cheek, lingering near the corner of her mouth in a touch that was both tender and agonizingly restrained. She felt herself leaning into him, her own breath catching as he hesitated, the weight of their unspoken desires filling the silence between them. But even as he held her close, his hand cradling her face, his lips hovering just inches from hers, there was a quiet restraint in his touch, a silent respect that kept him from crossing the final line. Amal felt both grateful and aching, her heart caught between the desire to surrender to him fully and the knowledge of the boundaries they both held so carefully. For a long moment they simply stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, their breaths mingling in the cool night air, their bodies pressed close. She could feel the heat of him, the steady, grounding strength of his embrace, and yet there was a fragility to the moment, a sense that this was something precious, something to be cherished. Finally, Kofi pulled back slightly, his hand lingering on her face as he looked at her with a gaze that held all the words he would never speak. She saw the same struggle in his eyes, the same yearning tempered by restraint, and it filled her with a fierce, bittersweet joy. As he took a step back, his hand slipping from her cheek, she felt the chill of the night settle over her once more, a reminder of the world outside this moment. But even as the distance grew between them, she knew that something had changed, that the memory of his touch, his gaze, his quiet strength would stay with her, a warmth that would linger long after the midnight shadows had faded. Amal watched him disappear into the darkness, her heart filled with both longing and peace, a quiet certainty that, no matter where life took them, this moment, this connection, would remain with her forever, a love unspoken yet understood. A bond as steady and unyielding as the moonlit courtyard that had borne witness to their silent embrace. The train station was alive with movement, a bustling hive of people coming and going, their hurried steps echoing off the worn, tile floors. The air was filled with the smell of metal and oil, punctuated by the low hum of conversations and the occasional sharp whistle of a train. Amal stood at the edge of the platform, her gaze fixed on the steel tracks stretching out into the distance. She felt a hollow ache in her chest, a weight pressing down on her as she waited, struggling to keep her emotions in check. And then she saw him. Kofi moved through the crowd with a quiet confidence, his tall frame cutting a path as people brushed past him, none noticing the intensity in his gaze as he sought her out. When their eyes met, it felt as if the whole world fell away, the noise, the movement, everything dissolving until only the two of them remained. He approached slowly, his face calm but his eyes filled with a depth of emotion that left her breathless. They stood there, side by side, the cool morning air swirling around them, filled with the scent of coal and the faint warmth of sunlight filtering through the haze. He glanced down at his ticket, clutched tightly in his hand, and Amal felt a pang in her heart, a sharp reminder that this moment was all they had left. The silence between them was thick, heavy with all the things they could never say, with feelings that had been left unspoken for too long. Amal wanted to speak, to reach out and tell him all the things she had held inside, but her throat tightened, her words caught somewhere between her heart and her lips. She felt his gaze on her, felt the quiet intensity that had always been there, a presence that both comforted and broke her in equal measure. Slowly Kofi extended his hand, his fingers brushing against hers in a touch so light it sent a shiver through her. The warmth of his skin against hers, the strength in his gentle grasp, was almost too much to bear. She felt herself tremble, her own fingers tightening around his as if trying to anchor herself, to hold on to this fleeting moment that would soon slip away. They didn't speak, didn't exchange empty words or hollow promises. Instead, they stood there, their hands entwined, their eyes locked in a gaze that held all the emotions they couldn't express. Amal felt her heart breaking and mending all at once, a fierce, desperate love surging within her, mingling with the sorrow and the finality of this goodbye. The train whistle blew, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the air, signaling the end of their time together. She could feel the vibrations beneath her feet as the train drew closer, a physical reminder that this moment was slipping away, that he was slipping away. Her breath caught, her heart pounding as she tried to commit every detail to memory, the warmth of his touch, the depth in his gaze, the way he held her hand with a tenderness that spoke of promises made in silence. Without thinking, Amal lifted her free hand, her fingers brushing against his cheek, a feather-light touch that left her heart aching. Kofi closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, a small, almost imperceptible sigh escaping his lips. She felt his hand cover hers, pressing it gently against his skin, a silent plea, a wordless confession that mirrored the longing in her own heart. The train's rumble grew louder, the sound filling the station, but they remained rooted in place, lost in each other, lost in the quiet intensity of the moment. She felt his fingers trail up her arm, grazing her skin in a touch so soft it felt like a whisper, a promise, a memory that would stay with her long after he had gone. Her heart raced, her body alive with the warmth of his touch, with the fire he ignited within her. Kofi opened his eyes, his gaze holding hers with a fierce determination, a quiet strength that left her breathless. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, their breaths mingling in the cool air, the only sound between them the steady rhythm of their hearts. Amal felt herself drawn to him, a magnetic pull that defied reason, a connection that was as deep and unbreakable as the love she had kept hidden in the shadows of her heart. In that final, fragile moment, his lips brushed against hers, a kiss so gentle, so filled with yearning that it left her dizzy, her heart pounding with a mixture of joy and sorrow. The kiss deepened, their lips moving together in a dance that was both fierce and tender, a release of all the emotions they had kept locked away, a goodbye that spoke of love and loss, of longing and hope. The train's whistle sounded again, a harsh reminder that time was slipping away, that they couldn't stay here, wrapped in each other's arms, lost in a moment that felt both eternal and heartbreakingly brief. Kofi pulled back, his hand lingering on her face, his gaze filled with a quiet sadness, a tenderness that left her breathless. She could see her own reflection in his eyes, the same sorrow, the same longing mirrored back at her. As he stepped back, Amal felt the emptiness settle over her, a hollow ache where his warmth had been, a silence that was almost deafening. She watched him board the train, his figure blending into the crowd, her heart breaking with each step he took. She wanted to call out, to reach for him. But the words wouldn't come, her voice caught in her throat, her heart too heavy with the weight of their goodbye. The train's engine roared to life, a final, unyielding reminder that this was the end, that he was leaving, taking with him a piece of her heart that she would never get back. She stood there, rooted to the spot, her gaze fixed on the window where he sat, his eyes meeting hers one last time, a silent farewell passing between them. As the train began to move, Amal felt a tear slip down her cheek, a single drop that carried the weight of her love, her sorrow, her longing. She raised her hand in a final wave, a small, fragile gesture that felt like a lifeline, a thread connecting them across the distance that grew with each passing second. He raised his hand in response, his fingers pressed against the glass, a mirror of her own, a silent promise that he would carry her memory with him wherever he went. The train pulled away, disappearing into the horizon, leaving only the echo of its whistle and the emptiness that filled the station. Amal stood alone, the cool morning air wrapping around her, a silent witness to the love she had lost, the love she would carry with her, forever etched into her heart. As the platform emptied, as the noise faded into silence, she turned and walked away, her steps slow and steady, her heart heavy yet filled with a quiet strength. She knew that, no matter how much time passed, no matter how far life took them, this love, this moment would remain with her, a memory that would warm her heart on the coldest days, a reminder of the connection that had transcended words, a love that was as deep and enduring as the endless tracks stretching out into the unknown.